Hello once again everyone, Original Bloodies here, back again. We're doing another video, and the subject this time is that the Wii U, as I read on this article I came across, has more next-gen 1080p 60 frame per second games than the PS4 and the Xbox One. Now, I'm going to read you this article, we'll go through it bit by bit, and we'll discuss it. So let's get started. So this guy goes on saying, while a lot of fanboys have been clamoring around the Wii U like a wounded puppy, waiting to pounce like a jackal from the shadows, they have missed out on one very important fact, or facet, or whatever that's supposed to be, of this supposedly underpowered console. Not counting indie titles, it has more native 1080p 60 frame per second games than the Xbox One or PS4. Now, I'm not going to even waste time leading you around by the nose, though for page purposes and time spent on the page metrics, I'm sure everyone at the CB would prefer that, which is just cinema blend, I guess. But then he goes on saying, I'm just going to throw down the numbers like an American politician throwing up their hands and making money not to do their job. So the Wii U confirmed games to run native at 1080p 60 frames per second so far are Smash Bros. U, Bayonetta 2, Mario Kart 8, and then Rayman Legends from a while ago. So Super Smash Bros. Was confirmed to run at 1080p, as noted on My Nintendo News. Mario Kart 8 was confirmed to run without a hitch at 60 frames per second 1080p, and it's really no surprise when Mario Kart 7 on the 3DS runs at 60 frames per second already. And then Bayonetta 2 was labeled 1080p 60 frames per second a while ago, and even if we want to count HD remakes such as the Wind Waker HD one, since that was proven to be 1080p 60 frames per second as well, and then Rayman Legends from back a while ago. And then you also have Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, which is kind of upscaled, so it doesn't really count, but whatever. So we have about 6 next-gen games running at 1080p 60 frames per second for the Wii U, if you include Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate. Even if you want to knock off Wind Waker HD as a remake and a game that's not a real next-gen title, that's fine. We still have a nice cache of games on the Wii U that are native 1080p to prove its case. So on the other side of the coin, we look at the list of games running at 1080p and or 60 frames per second for the Xbox One and PS4, and things slim down drastically, almost to the point of non-existence. The list comes courtesy of NeoGAF members who were discussing the PS4 versus the Xbox One's 1080p 60 frames per second offerings, as noted on DualShockers. So for the PS4, there are only a few games that hit 1080p and 60 frames per second. Killzone Shadowfall hits the 1080p, in multiplayer is 60 frames per second, but in single player is only 30. Drive Club, which is 1080p graphics, or resolution, they're targeting 60 frames per second, but they have not been able to do that and haven't confirmed it yet. I should say they haven't done it yet, or they haven't confirmed it yet. Flower, which is, I believe, an indie game that was on the PS3 before, it is 1080p 60 frames per second, but that's not saying much because it's literally not very detailed. It's a very, very, very basic game. There's no reason it shouldn't be 1080p 60 frames per second. Then you go to Resogun, whatever the heck that is, 1080p 60 frames per second. Congratulations, another game there. I don't honestly know anything about it, so I'm not going to go into discussion on that. Now there's also Warframe and DC Universe Online that are also 1080p and 60 frames, but neither of those are native next-gen games. They're ports. So that would be the equivalent of looking through the Wii U's eShop and naming all the native 1080p 60 frame per second indie games and Wii ports. And by comparison, the Wii U would wipe the floor with the competition in that regard. So, but if we look at the list for the PS4, it says, while I love what Sony is doing with the console, we can see that Killzone isn't native 60 frames per second, but only 60 frames in multiplayer, with tons of downscaling on the graphics and visual effects. We also have Drive Club, which may be or may not be native 60 frames per second, as it seems as it's a bit of a toss-up. There's also Flower, but again, if we're counting Flower, then we may as well have to leave Wind Waker HD on that list. That means that we have 3.5 games on the PS4 side running at 1080p and 60 frames per second. On the Xbox One side, it looks even worse. We have Killer Instinct, which is 720p and 60 frames per second. Forza 5, 1080p, 60 frames per second. So congrats, you get one there, but it's a racing game, so whatever. And then Call of Duty Ghosts, which is 1080p, but doesn't look like they wrote it down there. You may as well scratch Call of Duty off that list because it's going to be 60 frames per second on the Wii U and the PS4. That just leaves us with Killer Instinct and Forza Motorsport 5. Granted, only one of those games is a next-gen title at native 1080p, which is Forza, which is native 1080p and 60 frames per second. So what does that leave us with? It leaves us with the Wii U being more next-gen than its supposed bigger and badder next-gen competitors. I'm guessing it looks really salty over in the Sony and Microsoft fanboy camps. This is especially embarrassing for the Xbox One because it's supposed to be an American muscle car of a gaming console, and it's getting out next-gen by the Wii U. It's like a 1970 Dodge Charger getting outclassed on the track by a tuned-up Honda Civic. Embarrassing. So, there you have it. And it says, P.S. Nintendo fanboys, you will need one of these. A flame-resistant. Yeah. So, there you have it. The Wii U, and I believe Monolith Soft's X game is also going to be 1080p 60 frames per second. But one thing we have to discuss here is it's all about games built specifically for the console. Nintendo is the best at making a game for their own console. They are better at it than, say, Microsoft is making a game for their console or Sony is for their console. Nintendo takes the most out of their own consoles. They literally can squeeze the most juice, the most innovation, the most everything, top-notch quality out of their system. So it's really no surprise that the Wii U is being used properly with Nintendo than Xbox One is with Microsoft, and the PS4 is with Sony. Now, later on down the road, this is just launch we're talking about. There was no Wii U games at launch that were 1080p 60 frames per second. The same thing's happening with PS4 and Xbox One. At launch, they won't be. After a while, they'll fix it and they'll get a grip on how to use their system properly, and then they'll get 1080p 60 frames per second. So I'll wrap this up by saying, as of right now, though, the Wii U does have a head start in the more next-gen games. You can't even argue that. It's fucking fact. So, this, as always, is Original Blood Ace. Stay tuned, more videos coming soon.